Good evening. It's sure good to see all of you tonight. Happy for the opportunity we have to study together. We're in the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 26. And last time we got down to about verse 16, where Judas was making the bargain with the chief priests and scribes to betray Jesus into their hands. Before we enter into our study this evening, we want to prepare our minds and ask God's blessings with a word of prayer. We'll ask Brother Sheldon to direct our minds. Amen. All right, so we want to look at the last Passover of the Lord with his disciples, and then take a look at maybe the institution of the Lord's Supper would be the next section after that. Again, I encourage all that have any thoughts or questions to speak up. Even though I'm standing up here behind this podium, it doesn't, it's a Bible class, and I welcome all the participation we can get in sharing in these spiritual truths that are taught here. I see that we still have a number that are sick this evening, and Melissa is not feeling well, so she's not here with me tonight. So all the support you can give me, I'll take it. Verse 16, at the end of the context there about Judas betraying the Lord for 30 pieces of silver, says, from then on he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. So he, as we know from John's Gospel, he was the Lord's treasurer, but now he's trying to, I guess, make money for himself and abandon the Lord. And he's got the 30 pieces of silver in his pocket, and he goes out and he's looking to listen to Jesus and hear about his plans and find out where he's going to stay at night so that he might be able to tip off the scribes and Pharisees on where they could secretly arrest him away from the crowds. And the Lord, of course, knows all things. He's going to be careful not to tip him off until it's the right time, according to God's plan for him to do so, which he's going to be arrested on Passover and be put to death, crucified on the day that God foretold and planned that it was going to happen. So here you have a man here taking 30 pieces of silver, and even though he was an apostle of Christ, he'd learned all of the teaching that the other apostles had learned, and he had even gone out and done miracles. You see the power that there is if you get caught up with greed. You get more interested in material things of this world, become friends of the world, how you can, no matter where you are right now, you can drift away from the Lord and be lost. So there's a warning with Judas for all of us that there's great power in selfishness and greed. And 2 days later, he's going to, of course, hand the Lord over to be crucified. And the warning is given to us about people that could do such things in the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews 6, verses 4 through 6, says, for in the case of those who have once been enlightened and have tasted the heavenly gift and have been made partakers of the Holy Spirit, and have tasted the good word of God and the powers of the age to come, and then have fallen away, it is impossible to renew them again to repentance, since they again crucified to themselves the Son of God and put him to an open shame. So there's some that become hardened, and they let those weeds of worldliness choke out the word in their heart. That's what the parable of the sower shows too, isn't it? That progressively these things can take us over and then fall away. And he said to turn your back on such evidence and such information as described there, it's impossible to turn that person back to the Lord. They're so hardened in heart to be able to renounce the Lord. I just think about after you've already done miracles and cast out demons and stuff like Judas had done along with the others, and then turn your back on the Lord, how hard did he have to set his heart to do that? So a warning to all of us to let's watch ourselves, make sure that we keep ourselves in the love of God. Verse 17, now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? So the first day of unleavened bread. Well, the Feast of Unleavened Bread kind of officially began on the 15th of Nisan, the first month of the year, the religious month of the year. It fell between the end of March and May, sometime. We can see that with Easter. It can go really early in April, or it can go way down, and according to where the moon is. It's all based on that. When the full moon is, they count 15 days from that. And so you have, or the new moon. And so you have the statement, it was the first day of unleavened bread. And usually the 15th, it's one of those things where they use language in different ways, just like we do when we're talking about time and dating things and the holidays. I've talked about this before. A lot of people get really confused trying to figure out what day of the week it is, because you could call the first day of unleavened bread the 15th, and this is the 14th. Is what he's talking about. It's when this happens. But they always got rid of the leaven at the beginning, at evening of the 14th, which would be Wednesday evening, like right now, this was the week Christ was crucified. And they got all the leaven out that day. So really, that was the first day of unleavened bread as far as you not having it in your house, right? The Feast of Unleavened Bread started on the 15th. So they're speaking in a way, I guess, that people ordinarily spoke about. The 14th was the first day of unleavened bread, in the sense you didn't have any leaven in your house. Starting the 15th, you started that official Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it went 7 days. Josephus talks about these things and the Passover in the same way. There's some confusion about the way Passover is used in the Gospel of John and in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You remember the scribes that brought Jesus to Pilate? They said they didn't want to go in Pilate's house because they didn't want to make themselves unclean, because they wanted to eat the Passover. Well, Jesus ate the Passover the night before. That's when everybody was eating the Passover. So people think, well, maybe there's 2 different Passovers, or we can get all confused. But they talked about the whole thing. That whole week was called Passover in the way that they talked a lot of time, the way Josephus talks about it. All of the days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they called that Passover too. And they had sacrifices every day during those 7, 8 days. And the priest would eat those sacrifices. That was part of their duty. And you couldn't be made unclean, or you couldn't eat the Passover food that was there. They had feasts on the 15th, the day Jesus was crucified. That was an important day. It's called the day of preparation for the Sabbath the next day. So anyway, a lot of times we just don't understand, I think, because we weren't living at that time. Unless you look at all the Jewish sources and stuff, it can get confusing, about the timeline. But we're on Thursday. They're getting the meal ready on Thursday. Thursday, after the sun goes down, they'll have the Passover meal that's talked about, when they were going to come out of Egypt, when it started. And they have the lamb that's going to be sacrificed in the afternoon between 3 and 5. And then they'll have the meal. So it's the first day of unleavened bread. It's the 14th. It's on Thursday, the way we count time during the daytime. And Jesus is saying that they need to have a place prepared to take the Passover. You had to have 10 people for each Passover lamb, is what the rabbis, practiced. And they'd have as many as 20 that could use one lamb. Here you're going to have Jesus and 12 apostles that are going to eat the Passover together. And so that falls in that practice that they had at that time. And so we need to get ready for this Passover meal that has arrived. So they need a lamb, they need the sauces and the herbs and the fruit of the vine and the unleavened bread, all these things that they ate at the Passover. Need all that prepared. There needs to be a place where they can all meet together for that meal. And Jesus has, of course, really planned this all ahead of time. It's all according to God's design here. In verse 18, and he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. So Jesus had a disciple. He had a man that was ready to give his home over at a moment's notice to Jesus to use for this Passover meal. It sounds like there was some prearrangement where Jesus had talked to the man that he would have been expecting these disciples to show up at some time and ask for that room, because he's got the room already as far as the furniture and all. It's all prepared. I think we've mentioned when we preached on this in the Life of Christ series that very likely was the home of Mary, that John Mark's mother. There was a young man on the night after the Passover in Mark's Gospel that followed Jesus and the apostles out to the garden. And when they came and arrested Jesus and the disciples fled, he also fled. And the Romans, or the soldiers, grabbed Mark's clothes and he ran out of them and went off naked in the night. So it's very likely he was there at the house. It was his house that they were having this in the upper room. And he, like, I was wanting to see what was going on. He followed them where they went, and then he got caught up in everything. And he's the only one that tells us about that in his gospel. So anyway, they are going to go find this man, and they walk in, and Jesus had given them certain instructions about what was going to happen ahead of time that you find in the other Gospels, that there's going to see a man carrying a pitcher of water, which usually that was what women would do, would carry the stuff around, but this man was carrying it. And a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. And in Luke's Gospel, it adds in Luke 22:10, and he said to them, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house that he enters. So Jesus tells them exactly what's going to happen. Just like when he told them about the colt for the triumphal entry. You're going to go, you're going to find these tied up, they're going to be there. And they went and everything was exactly like he said. And then they took them, and the man said exactly what Jesus said he would say when they said, the master has need of these. Same thing here. The Lord knows, no human being can foresee the things Jesus can. That guy would be walking along with that pitcher at exactly that moment that they traveled 2 miles to get there and walk up. So the Lord has perfect knowledge about the future. And of course, all of this would certainly throw Judas off as far as if they were wanting to arrest him before he could have this last meal. Judas is not going to know where it's at. He sends Peter and John to do this. And it's all kind of coded in such a way that Judas he wouldn't know where the man with the pitcher's going to be or where the room's going to be until it was time to show up at the meal. And then he could go along with the others and be there. So it would thwart whatever plans he had. The other Gospels tell us it was Peter and John that were the ones that were sent. Any other thoughts on any of these verses here? Anybody's got, or anything anybody wants to add? All right. So when they get into the city, they'll talk to this man and say, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. So notice how Jesus is the teacher. This man that they're talking to understands there's one teacher. There's one great rabbi. And of course, we don't call anybody else my teacher, do we? There's only one person that gets that title, and it's Jesus, because he is the ultimate rabbi. He's the one that is the source of God's teaching. And so this man evidently is a believer. He believes that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the teacher that we're all supposed to follow, the prophet that was to come into the world. And he's ready to serve any way that he can. And of course, it's kind of a model for how all of us should be. If the master has need of anything we've got, we're ready for the Lord to use it, right? Anything of mine you might need for help. Isn't that what the early church did when there was needy brethren? Anything of mine, I'm willing to share it, so that nobody will be in need. And this man had that same kind of spirit. He's a wealthy man to have an extra upper room, and a place that all of these men can gather to have that meal. Not everybody had a house like that. So somebody with some means, we're told in Mark 14:15, and he himself will show you a large upper room furnished and ready, prepared for us there. So all of the couches are there and the tables are there. Everything's been prepared that way ahead of time. All they have to do is take care of then the lamb, making sure it's roasted and the different other things prepared for that meal. And so shows that upper room. Furnished means carpeted. That word there is, so probably divans for dining on, stretching out on these couches around the table in the manner that they ate in those days. So everything needs to be set up and made ready. The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. So they obey the Lord's statements there, and they're ready, have everything prepared. Once the animal has been, the lamb has been sacrificed and then prepared, they can all meet together on that Thursday evening then to have this meal. So they roasted the lamb. They have unleavened cakes of bread, because we've already said it was the first day of unleavened bread. There's no leaven, right? So we know what kind of bread is at the Passover. It's unleavened bread, and it represented that bread of haste. You remember the first time they ever had the Passover, they were in a hurry, right? You didn't have time to knead the bread and let it rise and anything like that. You had to fix it and be ready to leave at any moment. You ate the meal standing up the very first time, right? Because they got the order in the night from Pharaoh to get out, right? And then they left. Every Passover after that, they could eat at leisure. You could lay down and eat the meal, because now you're free men. You're not slaves anymore, right? And that's what the Jewish rabbis say about it. There was one commentator argued, well, you had to stand up to eat this meal, so this must not have been the real Passover. It was one of the arguments I saw. No, that was the very first Passover they didn't sit down. After that, the practice was to relax. You're free. You're not in Egypt anymore, right? And you could enjoy this meal with your family and in leisure there as you're eating it. So they have the room all prepared and set up for them. And again, once the sun goes down on Thursday, the way Jews counted time was that would be Friday, right? As soon as the sun went down, they counted from evening to evening as far as the day. So it's really, Friday's already started when they're having this meal. Yes. When people are making arguments, and we want to reason correctly about, authority, there's a command and there's examples, and then you have to ask the question, well, when is an example binding and when is it not binding? And well, of course, it has to be consistent all across. That's just one step, though. You also have to ask, is this thing that they were doing, did it have some spiritual significance to it, right? Is we supposed to put significance on where we're at when we worship? Jesus said it does not matter, right? Whether in Jerusalem or in this mountain, Mount Gerizim, it matters how you worship. It doesn't matter where you worship. Isn't that what he taught the woman at the well? So whether you're in an upper room or a lower room or you're in the basement, that can't be, you can say, well, there were examples of it, but they're not significant. There's no spiritual thing attached to it. I think the same thing comes into, we're going to talk about the cup. And I think they had a cup and they shared it. They all had their individual cups. I mean, that's the way it appears to me. But people make the argument, it says the cup, a cup. Is there significance to a cup? Does that matter, the drinking vessel? Does the Bible put any spiritual significance on that? No, it doesn't. It talks about what's in the cup. And it talks about the bread and what they represent. The container doesn't represent anything. You have to read that into it. It's not in the text. So whether they had 1 cup or 12 cups or whatever, that part doesn't even matter. It's what's in the cup. The fruit of the vine is what the emphasis is put on. So anyway, it's sort of a side trip, but sometimes those are good too, right? We can learn something. So they have 4 cups of fruit of the vine that they would pass. We say 4 cups of wine. Actually, the word for wine is never used in connection with the Passover. It's never used in connection with the Lord's Supper. So maybe I need to strike that out of my notes there. I'll have another, when I'm talking about the cup, we'll talk about that. Yeah, now the word wine, it's just another aside. That word is used like water, like we use water. We talk about swimming in salt water or fresh water or whatever. We just use water for all of those things, right? And when they said wine, that word meant fermented or unfermented. They used it both ways. And in English, we have the word wine. And if you look at the Oxford Dictionary and it gives you the original way it was used in English, that we use it exactly the same way. We used it for grape juice, and you use wine to talk about fermented. Now, in modern times, it seems like we almost exclusively think of wine as alcoholic wine. But it wasn't used that way in the Bible, and it's not used that way even in early English. And so we don't want to read that into it when we see it. We have to say, in the context, is this talking about grape juice? Or is this talking about something that'll make you drunk, right? So now when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples. So sundown, they start to have the meal. They're starting Friday now. And it was time to eat the Passover meal. And it doesn't describe in detail the meal. We know from history and what's been handed down among the Jewish people and some of the passages in the Old Testament, some of the things that were done. At least they came to have 4 different cups that they passed. We know there's going to be a cup after supper. The last cup, he takes it and he institutes the Lord's Supper with it. So they have their Passover meal, and then he's going to institute the Lord's Supper at the end. So it must have been a wonderful time. I mean, the last opportunity Jesus had to be with his disciples, he was determined to have that final meal with them and able to enjoy that physical, earthly fellowship one last time before all of the things are going to happen in the garden and at the cross. And then there's not ever going to be a time that physically he will eat the Passover or eat a physical meal. I guess he took a piece of meat right after his resurrection, right, a couple of times. Not really like this, where you're sitting down and really enjoying yourself. Maybe on the seaside, that could have been. So at the first Passover, I mentioned that earlier, they stood, but later on they had it in a relaxed fashion. And he says, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." In John's gospel, he tells us a little more information. When Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, that one of you will betray me." So he has perfect foreknowledge about Judas's crime and what Judas is up to, but it still troubled him in heart. When you talk about the Lord's passion, his suffering, this is part of his passion. Part of his suffering is that one of his best friends that spent the last 3.5 years with him would betray him. And even though he knows he's going to do it, it still hurts, right? And if anybody in the Lord's church was to betray you, and it can happen sometimes, it hurts. But you don't quit the Lord, do you? Jesus didn't go, "Oh, well, I got hurt. I'm out. No more following God's plan." No, he went on and did what he had to do, but it hurt. And it hurts us if stuff like that happens in the church. But we've got to be faithful to the Lord. Doesn't matter if it's our best friend betrays us. That's supposed to be a good Christian. If they do something like Judas did, you still stay faithful to the Lord. You don't let that turn you out of the way. So he says, one of you is going to do this. He had trouble in his spirit, and he told them by inspiration this was going to happen. And the word betray means to hand over to your enemies. He's going to hand me over to those that want to kill me and hurt me. And he lets Judas know, I know all about it, and he lets the other disciples know so that later on they'll remember this, that he knew it ahead of time. And he says, one whose hands are on the table, it says in Luke 22. Doesn't that even make it more? One of you that's got your hands right here on the table with me is going to do this thing. In intimate fellowship with me. That, to the Eastern people, that you would have a meal with somebody and they would betray you is like the greatest insult that could possibly happen. You know, and that's exactly what's going to happen. One of the 12, the chosen apostles, is going to do this. Verse 22, being deeply grieved, they each one began to say to him, surely not I, Lord. You see him sitting there at the table. It's just total shock. And Jesus is grieved, and all of his apostles are grieved when they hear this word, except all but one. One of them knows what's going on. But the rest of them, they're just shocked that anybody among them would do this. And they're all questioning themselves and asking the Lord, surely it's not me. Surely it's not I. I think that says a lot about the disciples and their humility, that they would ask the Lord that. They didn't say, well, absolutely, it's not me. Say, surely, Lord. Say, no, it's not me. And it shows something about the way we should walk humbly with God every day. When we're reading passages about Judas, or we're reading passages about this person that sins in the Bible, or we hear about some other Christian somewhere that's fallen, instead of, oh, well, I would never do such a thing as that. A lot of people talk to themselves that way. You should say, surely not I. Surely I'm not going to do something like that. Knowing that it's possible that we could do something like that. Surely not I, Lord. The other Gospels say the disciples began looking at one another at a loss to know of which one he was speaking. So they're just beside themselves in doubt about this. And who is it? Is it you? Is it me? In Luke's Gospel, and they began to discuss among themselves which one of them it might be who was going to do this thing. Terrible thing. One of us is going to do it. One of us in this room is going to do that. Because the Lord's always right, isn't he? Everything he ever says is right. If he says it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And there's a passage there in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, doesn't it say, he who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. So we read those Old Testament stories about those people in the wilderness and how they fell away, even after they saw the Red Sea divided and they got the manna and the quail, and all of those things happened, and they still wouldn't go in the promised land, and they rebelled against Moses. And you say, well, I wouldn't do anything. What does the Bible say? Take heed lest you do the same thing, right? It's possible for us to crave evil things and worldly things and do the same thing those people did. So you have to think that way. A couple of other passages. Nathan, could you read Proverbs 28:14? I thought that proverb was... I was looking at parallel verses to it, surely not I, that it has in our Bibles. And that is a really good verse. So what does that say you better do? You better fear the Lord every day and not let your heart get hardened to where you think, oh, sin's not going to bother me, right? Every day we should live with the consciousness of the fact we could fall. We could mess up. Romans 11 and verse 20, it tells us not to be conceited, but fear. And what's he talking about? In the tree of faithfulness, that started with Abraham, and they had the olive tree, and the branches that were unfaithful, the Jews, were broken off. And now you Gentiles have been grafted in. It says, but you better fear. Don't be conceited. You better fear, because you can be broken off, right? If you stop believing. So, yeah, that's right. If we become unfaithful and we stop trusting like we should and obeying like we should, what's going to happen to us? So, yeah, let's stay humble. And again, Jesus is showing he's in complete charge of this situation and what's going to happen. And he is the divine Son of God. He's a human being and he's fully God. He's both. He has the grief. He suffers. He hurts, just like any of us would hurt if our friends betrayed us. But at the same time, he's God. He knows what the plan is. He knows what's going to happen. It's a mystery, isn't it? How the two natures of Christ just are all there all the time. You see them both. In almost every verse that you read, it may talk about something about his humanity, but then it'll say something that shows you, wait, he's more than a man at the same time. Again, they would be strengthened later. They'd always remember that night and those things that he said. And a blessing, it's all written down so we can read it and we can get the same impact from it. He said it and then it happened. Right? He knew. Verse 23, and he answered, he who dips his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. So, again, they ate with their hands. They didn't have the spoons and forks and stuff like we do. So you got to kind of picture that. They'd use their bread to dip with and to use as a spoon, I guess, and would use that. And they would have several of these bowls on the table. They had 12 around plus Jesus. So was it 2 bowls that were there? It would be pretty awkward to just have 1 bowl to dip in. I don't know. But he may be narrowing down the group maybe a little bit further. Instead of one of the 12, one of the 6 that's around one of the bowls, or one of 4 that's around a bowl. I don't know. But I mean, the bottom line is somebody eating with me, somebody that I'm providing this meal for, and yet he's going to stab me in the back. So that's part of it too. So I have a number of, again, it's been asked, why would the Lord go through all of this and say, one of you is going to betray me, and Judas is sitting right next to him. And one of you that dips in the bowl with me is going to do this. And then finally, we know in John's gospel that Peter asked John to ask Jesus, because John is right next to Jesus, who is it? And he will say that it's Judas. So Judas knows the whole time that it's him. And it's been said, he's kind of dragging this out, right? And doesn't the Lord make us wait a lot for stuff? We oftentimes wonder, well, I've been praying about this and I'm going through this problem and the Lord's just leaving me hanging here. But isn't that for our good? Don't you think a lot of times? You need to go through stuff like that, and it makes you think, it makes you contemplate and understand, where your dependence needs to be, and to wait on the Lord is a good thing. He could just tell them who it was, but he doesn't. He leaves it out there like it could be any of you. And so they're all having to look at themselves. So that is when we take the Lord's Supper, and we're supposed to examine ourselves and make sure our mind is right. We're appreciating what the Lord did for us, and we're to examine ourselves, Paul told the Corinthians, and see if you're in the faith. You got to test yourself. Is it I? Right? So he lets that drag out for a while before he points out at least to John who it is. It also increases Judas's guilt that he tells him, even though he's going to do it, he tells him, I know it's you. And yet he does it anyway. And there's several accounts in the Bible like that God, you say, well, what's the point of even telling a reprobate, or warning them or whatever? They've got their heart set, they're going to do it. But the Lord kind of like magnifies their guilt. It shows that he gave them every chance, right? It wasn't God's fault Judas did what he did. The Lord gave him every chance not to do it. And he did it anyway. Yes, Sally. Right. Yeah, he got so hard that he would not turn. That's the problem. Yeah, I guess in a way the Lord tells all of us we're going to sin, doesn't he? He says, you will sin and fall short of the glory. I mean, if he told me right now I'm going to live another 10 years or whatever, I think he could tell me, Billy, you're going to sin. If you live till next week, you're going to sin. You're going to make mistakes. But what am I going to do? Am I going to turn when I do it? Or am I going to be like Judas and just harden my heart to destruction? He told Cain, didn't he, beforehand? Remember when he told Cain, he said, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you. And he tried to reason with Cain, don't be angry, repent. But instead he kept that anger and killed his brother. He went out and sin did get him, just like God said, it's waiting on you out there. So we have times like this where the person's told and they go ahead and do it. It just makes them all that more guilty if they went ahead and did it anyway. Again, people betray you. Don't be discouraged to where you won't serve the Lord. It's not his fault. People do what they do, and you've got to do what you've got to do, right? No matter what other people do, stay faithful to the Lord. I've always told my children, we've been in, I think, 11 different or at least I have 11 different congregations over the years, and there's people everywhere that disappoint you. There's times I disappoint people, but I mean, it's going to happen. There's people who are in the church. You think, oh, this other congregation, if I just went over there, everything would be great. There's people over there too, and they're going to disappoint you sometimes. But you don't take it out on the Lord when people disappoint you. You stay faithful to the Lord. Right? And here, the Son, he stayed faithful. The Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. So Jesus, again, Judas is hearing all this too. So it'd be better if he weren't born than to betray the Son of God like this. But that's what he's going to go ahead and do anyway. But I'm going to go just like it's written. This has all got to happen according to God's plan. The Messiah had to come, live this perfect life before people, and die innocent of all sin on the cross so that everybody else could be atoned for, so we could get out of sin. It's God's plan. It's the greatest plan there's ever been, right? To save people. Never entered into the hearts of men to come up with such a plan, but God did. And Jesus is going to carry it out. So it's been written in the prophets, and we can read those prophecies, Psalms 22, Isaiah 53, and a lot of others, where it's all laid out that the innocent one's going to die for everybody else, right? The servant of God, and be raised from the dead. So his death looks like a big triumph for the enemies, but it's actually going to be the gracious plan of God that everybody's going to celebrate for the rest of time. At least Christians will. Every Lord's Day we celebrate it, don't we? When we take the Lord's Supper. It's not just a morbid thing, the Lord died. But the Lord died so we could live, so we could have forgiveness, so we have a hope of heaven. You know, it's a mixture of things in your mind when you take the Lord's Supper. It's not just, oh, the Lord had to die for me, but look what he brought me. It's a celebration too, isn't it? What the Lord does for us in dying. He's going to say, this is the blood of the covenant. So that blood's what gives us this new plan where it's the blood of the covenant. We'll look at that, Lord willing. Is that the first bell? Second bell. Okay. All righty. We'll come back and look at the institution of the Lord's Supper, Lord willing, next time.